Hi, hello. Giant Bomb's coverage of E3 2019 continues. I'm Jeff Gerstmann. Okay. I pointed at the sign. By law, I'm forced to. We're joined by more guests from Game Workers Unite. We've got Emma Kinema. How are you doing?
Good.
Great, thanks for coming. And Jocelyn Monahan from Riot Games.
Yep, hello.
How are you?
I'm doing all right. How
Great.
are you?
I'm good. Yep. Alex Navarro.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Giant Bomb.
Yes.
What is that about?
Some bullshit.
Yeah, okay. Emma, my father was an owner of a small business. He had pretty particular opinions of unions.
For sure.
So growing up, that was all I ever heard, was just like, oh, unions, there's, I had to go out of business, if, like this sort of stuff. For people out there, and actually for me to a certain extent,
Sure.
What is a union and how does it benefit game developers?
So at its most essential, so there's a lot of baggage and cultural context.
Right.
There's, large national unions, there's like stuff like that. But at its most fundamental, what a union is two or more coworkers coming together, identifying issues in the workplace, and using collective power to actually organize and fix those issues in the workplace. Bare bones, that's what a union is.
Right.
It scales up to these large national unions that more people are familiar with, but that's actually, at the end of the day, what it is. And it's really about workers coming together, talking to one another, and actually building democracy in the workplace. Because a workplace traditionally is very top-down, it's very hierarchical.
Right.
And union building is really about giving some voice and leverage back to the workers. It's about getting a seat at the table. It's about actually being able to have a say in how our companies and our studios and our games are made.
And that sounds like, because I think when the average person thinks unions, you think like Teamster at the docks,
Sure.
telling you not. Or when we used to load things into E3 ourselves, there would be someone going like, you can't load that in here. That's on wheels. If it's on wheels, I gotta move it, and you gotta pay me this and do this. And it's like, whoa. But it sounds like that there's a lot of other stuff around that.
Yeah. And those cases, they are kind of silly on the surface sometimes. Like I worked in film. There was a period where like you could be moving something backstage and it's IATSE territory, and then it gets back out to the loading docks, and now the Teamsters have to move it, right?
Right.
But there's a reason for that, right? It's very important that those kinds of roles are delineated in those contracts, because it means the bosses have no power over breaking the contract and making people do work that actually just isn't their job.
Right.
And so it's actually helpful to have some of the kind of regular structure set into
kind
contracts.
of clearly defining, like, okay, here is what your role is. Here's what you're going to be judged against and compensated against, more or less.
And that can go a little too far sometimes, but really that's set by the workers themselves. Those workers in those unions together decided that was what was appropriate for their industry and their workplaces. I think, for instance, in the games industry, a lot of people wear a lot of different hats. I see a lot of people who are, part programmer, part artist, right? I've personally bounced around from QA testing to production to, language translation and stuff like that. And so it's like, I don't think breaking out by discipline in that way is helpful. Myself and most of the organizers that I know all throughout the industry really believe in what's known as the industrial model, which is everyone in one shop. If you work together on the same product from the same company, one big union all together. It provides a lot more flexibility, and you don't see those kind of striations between different disciplines that I think people have a conception of, especially coming out of things like entertainment.
And in some cases, the lack of a union and the sorts of things that can go on in a company can lead to things like walkouts.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Like the one at Riot Games.
Yeah.
So you can give people some backstory as to the run up to, as you see it, like the run up to the walkout and how that's gone.
Do you want like the 1
I mean, we could go
version?
like 9 hours, honestly, but we should probably.
So I can give you like the 1 month ramp up, or like the 1 year ramp up.
Probably the 1 month. It sounds like it's probably you could do a multi-year ramp up. From the
Yeah,
sounds of
there's
things.
a bunch. So the 1 year ramp up was basically there was an expose from Kotaku about sexism at Riot, and that started a lot of conversations about what was happening at Riot, working conditions there. Some stuff was changed, some stuff wasn't, and so. In the lead up to the walkout, there was basically a lot a lot of emotions. It's like Riot is a really emotional place. It always is, because it's one of those game companies where people really love what they do and really identify with the company, which, as you know, is like a
Mixed bag.
Yeah. So it means people are really passionate about making change and about working, but it also means that can be exploited by a variety of ways. So what happened was, people were really frustrated that they were getting news from Kotaku instead of internally. People were really frustrated that they felt like people weren't being as transparent as they could be about changes that were going on. And some people felt stuff was going too slowly. And so what happened was, there were a couple of lawsuits filed against Riot, I think 5 in total. One of them got a lot of publicity, and that was one that was trying to certify a class action lawsuit, and that's going to come out in July, a decision on that. But there were 2 others that were sort of smaller and not really widely reported on until Riot filed a motion to compel arbitration in those cases. So like many tech companies, which is changing now, but like many tech companies, Riot has a kind of blanket arbitration clause which says, hey, if you sue Riot for anything other than employment conditions, you have to go to private arbitration. You can't be in open court.
Right. Which then means, like, basically they're bringing in their person, their representative to arbitrate. It's not always a neutral third party, right?
So they say it's a neutral third party because both people agree on it, but there's like a pool, and it's like, at Riot, we call it a pick ban phase, right? Like, so like you ban candidates out of it. So they'll be like, we don't want this one, you don't want that one, we don't want this one, you don't want that one. And then you end up with one who is paid for by the company. And there's like a bunch of research that shows that arbitrators, especially who have worked with a company before, tend to be loyal to that company.
Right.
Because they pay their paycheck.
They pay them,
So, hey.
I mean, at bare minimum, that's a conflict of interest, right?
Exactly.
Even if nothing's going on, like, you can draw the A to B to C and go like, okay.
Sure. So what happened was that was the sort of like ramp up. The ramp up was actually really short because there was all this big long buildup of emotion at Riot, and then this was the flashpoint where it was like, we're finding out something from Kotaku that we wish we hadn't done. We're finding out that every time Riot takes 2 steps forward on sexism, it feels like they take a step back. This is that. And these are current employees of the company suing Riot. They're like our friends and coworkers, and they're basically just getting screwed. And this isn't what everybody at Riot thought, but it was enough people that like this idea of a walkout emerged. And so it was just kind of like it was an exploding powder keg, essentially, of a lot of issues.
Yeah. And so the walkout happened.
It did.
And did it lead to any real, like, or lasting? I guess lasting might be the wrong word because, you know, it is all still pretty fresh. But did management react to the walkout in a way that was favorable to the employees?
Management reacted. They reacted. So when the walkout. The series of events was kind of interesting because the walkout document was distributed. Not that many people saw it. And then management was like, hey, heard there's going to be a walkout. And we were like, oh, I guess there will be then. So then it kind of blew up. It blew up. And then in the lead up to the walkout, there are company all hands. And there was a page released on Riot's website alongside the all hands that was like, hey, we hear you guys. We understand you're upset about forced arbitration. We somehow didn't anticipate that would happen as much as it did. So we're going to commit to, the commitment they have made is that after the current litigation is over, they will change the policy to be opt-in for future employees. They have committed to possibly committing to a position in the future someday after the end of litigation that they will maybe end it for current employees. Maybe. Yeah.
They'll consider maybe doing it.
Yes, they'll consider maybe taking a stance on it, which I think is their way of like winking and saying, yeah, we're going to do it. But they can't officially say that because of lawyers or something.
Yeah. Well, I guess ongoing litigation probably complicates everything because if they come out and say, yes, we're ending it, then the lawsuits would be like, well, end it right now. What are we doing?
Yeah. So the status of the current lawsuits is so the status of the current lawsuits is they filed this motion because arbitration doesn't automatically kick in. You have to file a motion to compel it. So last week, the lawyers in those 2 lawsuits filed a motion to oppose, and that was continued until July. So in July, for those of you at Riot Games, or not, we're going to have a fun moment where we find out if a class action suit is certified, and we find out if there's precedent for forced arbitration to be turned over. So at that moment, we will find out if a whole bunch of women are all allowed to sue Riot at the same time without being blocked by it.
Right. Yeah. So a big moment.
Yeah.
This seems like the sort of thing that if a union was in place that could maybe kind of move these things along. Am I right on that? Like, would a union have more power to kind of head off some of these arbitration clauses before they became this kind of problem?
Absolutely. I mean, what we're talking really about is a systemic issue. It's a structural issue. The fact that arbitration is a thing that the company can enact on people because it's in their contracts, right? If we came together as a union and actually negotiated what was actually in our contracts, because as individuals we really can't do that very much. We have no individual power when negotiating with like a potential employer. But as a collective, as all of the workers, we absolutely could negotiate. And things like arbitration clauses are things we could actually have removed from the industry's contracts, as a whole, right?
Right.
And it could change it so that way it prevents things like this happening in the future and being a more proactive force rather than just reactive, something bad happened at a company. But really organizing is about being proactive and actually building structures, building solidarity, building community, building power preemptively so that when things like this happen, when companies do mess up, the workers are actually ready to speak up and like change things in real time.
Right. And, that change also seems to, we've been talking a lot about crunch. We've been talking a lot about, work-life balance and just number of hours on the job, whether it's forced, whether it's like socially kind of pushing someone into coming in on the weekends, that sort of stuff. Would you say that that's like kind of the number one issue that led to a lot of the union talk over the past couple of years now?
I think the current push for unionization really comes from many different intersecting variables. It's really not any one thing. I do think the conversation around crunch has dominated the industry for like the past few years, and that has built a culture where people are more willing to talk about these kind of systemic issues in the industry. And when you start thinking systemically, you start trying to find solutions that are systemic. And just, individually speaking out against things won't fix things. And so a systemic fix is unionization. And so I think that definitely is something to play with it. I actually do think the conversation around crunch needs to be moved past almost in some ways, in that I think we are limiting the discussion, because when I look at the industry, like, yes, I've dealt with crunch in my studios, right, when I've done work. It's a huge issue that does affect a lot of people. That's something we can work on, right? Whether that's making sure that people doing overtime are paid, or workers can opt into crunch, or decide together, like, maybe this is a thing we need to do to get this out the deadline, but it's not managers breathing down our neck, right?
Yeah.
And
it's not like, hey, if I'm not a part of this, I'm going to be ostracized and slowly pushed out the door.
Like at my studio, it's opt-in. They say, we're going to do some overtime. People who are interested can do it, right? And I think that's pretty much as good as I've seen in any studio so far. And yet there's still a social pressure. There always will be, because if I don't show up, I know my fellow QA testers are going to be showing up, because either one, they feel the social need to do so, or two, they're not paid well enough, and there's a financial pressure because the day job, 40 hours a week, actually doesn't cover rent in an expensive place like Orange County. And so there's a financial pressure. It's a soft one. It's not one that's spoken, but it's absolutely real. Like, I have people making minimum wage in my studio who do overtime only because that's the only way they can afford rent, right? So when that comes up, you have to jump on that opportunity. But there's so much in crunch, like, to explode beyond the conversations of just health and safety. But I think people really need to also consider other issues, things like ageism, right? Burnout in the industry, just things like forced arbitration, things people don't really talk about or are aware about. There's so many things we can talk about and can be fixed by systemic things like workers actually making collective decisions for the betterment of the workplace. And that's what a union is.
And it seems like, it's a better workplace. I feel like there's been studies saying, like, hey, a happier, better workplace that isn't necessarily crunching their people into dust or, or forcing them into arbitration, like, hey, they might actually turn out a better product in the end.
Absolutely.
Even if it might take slightly longer because you didn't work them 18-hour days or whatever, right? I mean,
there's been a lot of kind of historical evidence of and actual studies done with like hard numbers that show industries that have unionization and non-unionized sectors. The unionized sector, on the whole, one turns out their product faster on average, and also at a higher level of quality. Almost as a universal factor across the board.
Wow.
Whether that's because things are more efficient because the workers who are actually doing the work are in charge. That means they get to set the processes themselves and not people who are kind of abstracted, people in management, right? Or people are really invested. Something about unionization that people don't talk about is it creates worker investment in the workplace. You actually feel like I have some stake here. I actually have some ownership here. I have my voice heard through the support of everyone else.
Yeah.
That's a really powerful thing, and it's kind of intangible, but it's like, if you want to like make a really great working culture, let your workers actually dictate the working culture.
Right.
And if they're not going to let us dictate it, then we need to build power so we actually can.
Right. And that seems like something that, like a smaller team can dictate that culture because it's a very small team,
Sure.
and they're accountable to each other and that sort of thing. But I imagine, like as a studio gets larger and larger and larger, it's easier to just kind of be like, okay, well, I am 9 levels away from the people making those sorts of decisions, so I just have to show up every weekend and that sort of stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing is, as Emma and I have discussed a lot, we kind of did ass backwards the way the walkout was organized, because normally if you wanted to do something like that kind of action, you would spend a really long time talking to people and getting them on board. And whenever you sent out that call, you would know that a certain number of people are going to show up.
Yeah.
We didn't have that luxury because it was this kind of like flashpoint. But what we did have was a similar, like uncannily similar kind of culture that had emerged organically. So like there's like Riot designed a culture, a bunch of people bought into that culture, and then underneath that there was like a stronger version of it that was a bunch of people who like really care about Riot, really care about diversity, really care about their fellow coworkers, and those people were the ones that showed up. And they didn't really need to be convinced until they knew that someone else's face would be on it. And they were like, I know that this person is going to be out there, so I know I can be too.
Right.
And it was like a backwards move, but I think the reason that it worked, and I've thought about it a lot, is because that exact kind of like feeling like you were building that culture, and part of what makes that culture speak, that was brewing even before any organizing talk.
Yeah. We've started to see some companies, usually like it's accompanying a delay, or when a lot of people were pressuring Respawn with Apex Legends and saying like, yeah, you're not as fast as Fortnite, what's going on? And they eventually put something out saying like, hey, we're trying to treat our workers well. And we just saw, I think it was yesterday, or maybe even today, that Nintendo was saying, hey, part of the reason we're delaying Animal Crossing is because we don't want to crunch our workers. On one hand, that's nice. Does it ever feel like some of these companies are trying to use that as cover for delays, or kind of maybe trying to get an easy win out of a delay that makes it seem like we're pro-workers, but also we're going to push it back anyway? Like, have we reached that point yet with the conversation as crunch comes up more and more?
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
in some ways, I think it's a little more nuanced than that.
Sure.
Because I think you'd have to actually ask the workers there in
Right.
Respawn and in Nintendo and all these different places. But I think, yes, in general, studios are wising up to the kind of general discourse. They're wising up to the fact that people are starting to care. It's not
Right.
just enough to work in the games industry and then I can blindly accept how bad the conditions are. It's a real job. It's an actual career. People are trying to make lives and actually have families and retire one day, hopefully. That's less and less of reality, I guess.
I don't even know what that looks like.
Yeah, but and so I think companies are starting to understand that and include that in their messaging about whether it's production schedules being delayed or what have you, but also just like when hiring, some of these conversations are more about like we have a sustainable kind of production cycle, we really care about input and blah, 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 blah. And even in a great situation like Riot does actually foster a culture of like outspoken employees and people really actually wanting to improve like their actual teams and departments.
Yeah.
And that's really great. But I think it has to be codified into something a little bit more concrete because, again, just to have people ad hoc kind of advocating for themselves that's good, but that's step one. You have to build an actual platform and a foundation on which you can actually build an improvement for the future.
Well, something lasting, if,
Yes.
if it is this ad hoc thing of like, hey, this cadre of employees have decided to do this, well, when some of them move on, some of that power goes
disappear.
with them.
Yeah.
Or, they kind of disperse and maybe that studio doesn't have that anymore.
Yeah.
So it seems like formalizing it, getting it
Yes.
recognized, those sorts of things.
I think that's something that is really important to note about this conversation around unionization is that, I work at a studio that I actually think has a really wonderful production cycle kind of process, and they have a very, attentive approach to making sure people aren't overworking themselves and taking care of themselves, right? It's a pretty happy place. But that exists on the whim of management.
Sure.
And that is it. There's no guarantee that it's going to stay that way.
One wrong hire and you got someone in there
Absolutely.
that's like upsetting the entire company culture. And
It's chaotic. It's not professional to leave it just at the whims of management. So I would say even for those of us who love our studios, it's important to get that kind of stuff in writing. And that's what a contract can do. That's what being in a union can do. You can have that solidified and actually built into stone that this is how the way things are, this is how things should be done, and how the workers should be treated.
Yeah, I think at Riot it's been really tough because management can feel like we're attacking them, and
Right.
I've had
Yeah.
as the sort of dipshit internal and external face of this, I've had a lot of conversations with management and been like, hey, like, we're actually trying to avoid that narrative of workers versus management because Riot is this weird beast where like we do get to weirdly help dictate that, but at the end of the day, you guys are the ones that decide that. And like when the walkout first happened, management, they actually did something cool, which was that they took all of the managers aside and they were like, hey, like you have to let people do this. Like you can't tell them not to do this, because it's illegal. But also they were like, we just
very
want you
cool
to,
of them to say, don't break the law.
Yeah, they were like, we just want you to know we endorse this and we're so proud of all of our passionate employees and we just think it's great and also we're not going to change anything.
That sounds, I was going to say, that sounds exactly
Yeah.
like some of the press conferences we watched this week. We're proud of all the passionate feedback we've gotten about our game, and we hear you.
Later, the discourse has gotten a little less charitable to things like walkouts, and people are like, what? Why are they suddenly changing their mind? And I'm like, it's like when cops go to protest and hug the protesters and put it on the front page of the New York Times.
Right.
Yeah. Not to call all management cops, but it's like the very fact of them openly endorsing it like diminishes the leverage, right? And it's not that I or anybody that I know that I organize with wants to be in opposition to them. It is this like, hey, we need to codify it because our rights to do labor organizing are exactly the same now as they were the first time whenever you were like, we endorse this. Like, that is not, the fact that the message is shifting toward that over time is really troubling, actually. Because, it's a legally protected right. And that's been really hard for a lot of people to grapple with, I think, because it is that kind of sense of like, wait, how much power do we actually have?
I think you're also starting to see a shift in management's approach and rhetoric around the organizing that's been happening in Riot for a lot of reasons, but primarily because you're actually building real solidarity. You and all of your coworkers are doing amazing work to actually bring people together, get people's voices shared, make group decisions, and actually approach management with tangible changes you want to see. Yeah. And that scares the shit out of management. And that's the deal, right? Like when you actually start demonstrating power, it doesn't matter what they say beforehand. It doesn't matter, what kind of like pittance kind of gifts they try to do, like half measures,
Ice
like
cream
opting out.
everybody.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
right?
someone offered to bring a boba truck to the walkout, and
Yeah.
I was like, no,
Yeah.
honey, no. What? We love boba, but we don't love bribing.
It doesn't matter.
This is the man's boba.
I'll take the man's book, but
Fair enough.
So this is actually a question I have, which is, so I was reading an interview with you last year where you were talking about a little bit of sort of the management responses that have kind of come from like the initial wave of organizing. And it sounded very much like the things you were hearing was very much like management was just hoping this was something that would go away.
Yeah.
Kind of the
there
managers
should
of
be a
various
couple
studios.
months of bad press, and then it would fade out.
But, as more of these stories have kind of broke and more, workers are kind of speaking out, and as I think these kinds of movements are gaining more momentum, I'm curious if you've seen much of a shift in that kind of notion. Like, I know you have a thing on your website where you you have a way for managers to outreach and be like, hey, if I want to support this sort of thing, here's how I can help, if not necessarily like working in the, you know, exact worker organizing spaces.
Yeah.
But like, is there actually been a real notion of like, oh, this is actually going somewhere? Has there been like a real, like, any sort of galvanizing around like, we need to actually do something about this? Or is there still this feeling of like, this
Waiting
will
for this shoe to
eventually
drop or
just
something or fade.
dissipate?
Yeah, you're definitely right. Management at first was, you know, very much hoping this would disappear. You know, GDC 2018, they were hoping that was kind of like a weird one-off. You know,
Like an
we've had
aberration.
that before, right?
Yeah.
Like stuff with like, what was it, like 2013 or something with like Darius Kazemi.
Yeah.
But, like, there's been little bursts of like labor talk in the games industry, but I mean, part of the reason why it hasn't faded is like myself and a lot of my fellow organizers around the world are really stubborn motherfuckers, actually. Like, I work a 40-hour-a-week job, and I work 60 hours a week on top of that organizing. Like, every week.
Yeah.
And there are like dozens, if not hundreds of people doing that all around the planet. And I don't know, like, it's an important thing. People deserve dignity at work. People deserve democracy in their workplace. And I think people are realizing, like, this industry is going to kind of topple in under itself if it doesn't fucking change,
Yeah.
right? And we're just going to have to make that change, even though it sucks, even though it's tiring. And so, yeah, there's definitely been a shift in management kind of approaches to these kinds of conversations. I've had a lot of fellow workers kind of send me screenshots of like weird internal things that companies say on like the company Slack or Discord or what have you. You know, in Q&As at companies, like people will like upvote asking questions about unionization and stuff and what management's approach to it is. And it's always like these half-hearted, like, oh, well, we support everyone to have their opinion on these things.
We
It's like,
support the idea, we just don't know if it's right for us.
for sure.
Does it work in practice?
Yeah, like it's good
Who
on
can
paper.
say? Who can say?
Well, maybe the like several million people who are unionized in the United States.
Who are they?
Yeah. Like,
Different.
like the fact that I work in an industry that is worth 3 times the film and music industries combined.
Right.
3 times.
A point they love to make.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The fact that I work in that and I make essentially minimum wage living in Orange County, California, which is expensive as shit, and like I have years of experience and like I'm very good at what I do, like is absurd. Like it is
Yeah.
absurd. Like I have friends who work in construction and they make literally 3 or 4 times what I make. And like that's because they're union, right?
Right.
And like if they weren't union, they would not be making that money.
Oh yeah, I'm sure yeah, people would love to pay them
Historically,
less
they
if
would
they
be,
could.
oh,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
And they used to.
Yeah.
And then they were like, fuck this. We're going to band together and we're going to change this shit. Like,
Right.
we're not going to wait for anyone to like elect a politician to fix these things. We're not going to wait for legislation. We're not going to wait for compromise and discussion. We're going to just go and do this. We're going to get what is ours, rightfully.
And I think you talk about it being systemic, and it's just you know those were always the stories about going back to the arcade days. You know, plenty of just like people writing about the early days at Atari or what have you. People just going like, yeah, I was at the office for 36 hours straight.
Yeah.
And when we were launching. When GameSpot was splitting off a console site, Video GameSpot, and I was like the second employee there. We were gearing up for launch, and it was like, yeah, no, I'm sleeping at the office for, granted, it was like 3 days.
sure.
Some people do that every 18 months for whatever game they're wrapping up.
Or Google.
Or yeah, sure. And yeah, it's systemic. Yeah, you have a lot of people I think that are still in places, and have risen to even more positions, like larger positions of power over the decades, that still think that that's how video games are made.
Yeah.
You get these people, they're passionate, you get them in, you say like, it's good that you're passionate because you're going to be here a lot.
Yeah.
And then when that passion dries up, there's 20 more people that want your job tomorrow.
There's a reason why the average burnout rate is 6 to 10 years. Like,
Yeah.
people leave this industry on an average 6 to 10 years.
Yeah, I had someone.
Because of that.
Yeah, I had someone tell me once that if I wasn't actively training my replacement, I was doing my workplace a disservice.
I remember that.
And that this place was, always going to run on young, passionate men, is what I was told. And it was a very bizarre conversation. I was still relatively junior, and I walked out of the conversation going like, well, I've been pretty loyal to this place. Like, should I be training someone and leaving? It was just the most baffling
Yeah.
thing. And I think that, I agree with that. Like, there's just been so many studios and so many people that have been doing this for so long that maybe they don't know another way. And how do you approach people like that may have decades of experience, they've done it this one way, they're content to do it this one way, even if they don't necessarily think that they're like destroying people along the way. They're like, I don't see a problem with this, I don't get what the big deal is. Like, how do you illustrate to people that have been kind of in that chair for that long that like, hey, there is a better way, and it probably is better for your game as well, and better for the people out there playing them too. Like, what does that look like?
So I mean, this is the perennial kind of like question that organizers face, right? And I think the actual way you do that is not by offering facts and statistics about why you should have a healthier workplace, even though those facts and statistics line up with us. It's not about convincing them or out-logicking them. It's not about any of that. It's when you are talking to someone who isn't quite sure why this conversation is happening about unionization and why we have to change things and make things healthier, or like they're happy to overwork themselves because they care a lot, right? Like, I'm that kind of person. I'm historically the kind of person who loves to overwork. I mean, I work 100-hour weeks, so like voluntarily. So like, I get that when you're passionate about something. But I think the thing you have to do is actually ask them questions about themselves and help them work through various defensive barriers and walls we put up day to day, right? Like, even if you love your job, there's always something under there that bothers you, right? Like, every person has something. And the actual skill set of organizing is about asking questions and learning about our coworkers. So whether they're an experienced, like, multi-decade veteran of the industry, or, you know, a new person coming out of college this is their first job, you need to talk to them, find out what issues they're actually facing, and almost leave the conversation about unionization at the door. Learn about them first, and the things they're dealing with, and build a connection there, and help them realize that actually things maybe aren't as good as they think they are, right? And if someone really doesn't budge, like someone who is more experienced and is like, this is how it's always been, you know, I came up this way, why can't everyone else? Like, I think with that, you really have to share stories of other people's experiences, because I think that's the most effective way to actually get them to understand just how fucked up it is, right? Like, I have a coworker who's been in the industry for like 12 years. He overworks himself constantly, and he doesn't care about that. He's fine with that. It's his life to be in the industry. But I was talking to him, and I was like, okay, but I'm working with my friend over here who is supporting her mom through all kinds of medical costs. She's paying to support her family. She lives with her family, and she's making $12 an hour, right? And she's working 40 hours a week, and it's not enough to even just pay rent, let alone like actually help her family. Like, imagine being in that person's shoes. And I think building actual empathy about real human situations and like actual experiences is the way you get through to people. It's not about convincing and out-logicking people. It's about just being like, look at what is happening here, right? I work with a father who's like a new father, right? And I'm certain that the job takes a toll on that. And I've certainly worked with previous people who, you know, don't get to tuck their kids in at night because we're at the office until like 9 or 10, right? Every night. And they don't get to take their kids to school in the morning either. And, you know, the conditions are just ridiculous, and it's just not acceptable. It just isn't. Just flat out. So,
I think two things. I completely agree. And I think that this stuff at Riot, the first thing is, I feel like this conversation sounds so much like how we talk about diversity, and the best way to touch people's hearts when you talk about diversity, because I fondly remember when the first Kotaku article came out, and I looked at it and I said, that's funny. You know what would be even funnier is if this led to unionization in the games industry. And the reason is that there were so many people at Riot. The starkest thing at Riot was the people who were like, this was going on all of this time under our noses, and the people who were like, yeah, like, duh. Wait, I thought this was gonna be worse. Like, this is all they wrote? Like, seriously. Like, and a lot of the other stuff came out in like blog posts afterward. But part of what has happened is all of these conversations of diversity have to happen where like, it'll be someone who's like, well, I'm a woman and I've never been discriminated against. And we're like, yeah, you're a woman who's a senior leader who came in here in a position of power and you didn't have to go through these same things. Or like, I'm a man and I never went through this thing, and it's like, yeah, but look, this other guy went through that. And so you have to keep like sharing these stories. And then the other thing about the industry is that places are so different from each other and so different inside the studio itself that it gets really, really tough to have messaging that gets to everyone. And this is like one of the biggest things I face, because I do most of our stuff internally that's like, hey, this thing happened. I know everyone's upset about it. Here's what we're gonna say about it. Especially at a company that makes games and is also a big publisher, you have, first of all, a really weird divide between people who make games and people who distribute games. And then even within that, you have like a huge contractor labor force, which is like a whole other thing, right? Yeah. Where we have like multiple layers of contractors, some of whom work remotely in offices for completely different companies, some of whom work with us and are like independent contractors with Riot, some of whom come work with us and then weirdly stay contractors for like 8 years when they probably shouldn't be, stuff like that. Yeah. And then you have like, you know, the diversity overlay on top of it and the usual problems of seniority. And the only way to there is no way to craft a universal message there until you build like a shared understanding of what the situation is, and that's by sharing personal stories and like mapping that out, basically.
Yeah, I think something that a lot of people are kind of surprised by when they first learn about what actual unionization and organizing is like, is that it's very much not about just throwing like literature or flyers around. It's not about waving a banner and everyone rallying around
not
it.
Not like running up to a cork board.
Yeah.
And, hammer and a sickle, poster here.
We're not storming the boss's desk, right? We're not like slamming down doors and being like, give us the money. Like, it's genuinely not like that at all. It's absolutely about individual one-on-one conversations, actually building genuine connections in the workplace. And a fellow organizer once told me something that has really stuck with me for the last like several years. She said, at the end of the day, union organizing is about building a culture of care, which I find that really interesting. It's about building a culture of care. First and foremost, nothing else. Because without that, you can't have solidarity, you can't have power, you can't have like collective unified front. You can't have anything to build off of a better future, right?
Right.
It's about building a culture of care. And I think the work that you're doing and a lot of your coworkers are doing is building that culture of care. And it has to start there. It can't start with, you know, big flashy stuff. It has to be with that very simple, private, one-on-one conversation, actually talking to someone, making them feel heard, making them feel like someone actually gives a shit, right? And isn't just like rolling over and taking it. That's how you actually move things forward.
There's another angle I'm actually curious about on that front of the sort of building a culture of care kind of thing. One thing that this industry is maybe not particularly shameless about, or is very shameless about, is, I guess to a degree, weaponizing the consumer. You know, I think we saw a little bit of that this year at E3, you know, kind of taking the presentation of, we do this for you, we're here for you, we build these games for you, you are all that matters. Yeah. And as this sort of movement of organizing and sort of like, you know, moving toward unionization happens, you're also running into an audience that maybe A, doesn't really understand what this stuff means and why they should care. You know, it's very much like, you make the games for me, you're in the dream job that you talk about how great it is and all that, why should I care about why, you know, like your contract, why are you walking out of this company that I would, you know, give my right arm to work at, that kind of thing. I see that kind of messaging a lot from people who, when these stories are posted and when these things come out. I've also had people who can very clearly see through that, wonder what they can do to kind of support workers who are trying to organize. You know, boycotting is sometimes, you know, thrown around, but then you hear, like, say for instance, like at NetherRealm, people being like, don't boycott. Yeah. Bosses get paid first. It doesn't hurt anyone except us. Yeah. It doesn't impact us. Is there a way to kind of, or are you looking at a way to kind of try and bridge that gap with the consumer and sort of like inform them about like why they should care? Absolutely. And also, is there something that those people who are interested can do right now while this is still kind of in its nascent stage? Yeah.
No, I think the kind of question of players in our communities are super important. Because at the end of the day, we do make these games for people to play, right? It's not an insignificant consideration. I think things like boycotts, you know, from my experience and from, you know, talking to a lot of my like kind of peers throughout the industry, not a particularly like popular or strategic option. I don't think you'll ever get the momentum that could actually like financially shift something and cause to have real pressure on management. So I don't think it's a good tool that way. And yeah, at the end of the day, we're working our asses off and we want people to play them because we care about these games like a lot. And so I think that kind of stuff is not so helpful, but I think it is really important for us to be reaching out to players. And I know Game Workers Unite does that. I know a lot of people are doing a lot of really good effort to like reach out to their communities and try to continue to make them more understanding and more supportive. I think if a player wants to actually help with this, I think you have to understand that actually your role is not as essential as maybe some people make it out to be.
Right.
Really, at the end of the day, these problems will be fixed by and for and of the workers. We're the only ones with actual leverage in the workplace. We're the only ones who know how to actually fix things because we're doing the job day in and day out, right? But players can do things like stay up to date on these kinds of issues in the industry. Be educated about it. Share articles about what's going on at different companies in your player bases and in your community. I think just doing that simple distributing information role is very important. And I think if people can be also engaged in detoxifying certain online communities, that would be very, very helpful. Because certainly it's a thing that we have seen, workers who are more outspoken about wanting things to be changed for the better in their workplaces. Historically, we have seen a couple now examples of player bases being used against them by management, right? You look at ArenaNet, you look at Riot even, right? It's very much a case that the more extreme elements of our communities can be used against us as kind of like a threat of you need to shut up or the crowd's going to come get you, right? And that's not most players. Like most players aren't like that. And I think that's something to understand. It's not a single monolithic thing. And so I think if players can be in their communities actively making things better, making things more supportive, even just having a better understanding of what it means to make a game and what the back end of making a game looks like, I think does a lot to demystify the industry and make it seem just like a normal job, because it really kind of is. I show up to work, I clock in, I turn my computer on, I get coffee, right? Like, it's a normal job. It's not some mystery fantasy thing. And so I think demystifying that, and I think the media and press in the games industry has gotten better in the last 5 years or so. And I think that's seeing a huge impact on how people talk about these issues, because we're talking more about what it means to make a game, what actual production is like, what the business procedures are behind all of this stuff. It's not just a magic box shows up at the GameStop shelf or something, right?
Yeah.
And so I think demystifying and educating one another is the best thing that players can be doing.
Can I have 2 minutes of Riot Kool-Aid? I
Yeah.
promise. Okay. So this is the most pertinent question in the world at Riot. So Riot's motto is that we aspire to be the most player-focused company in the world. And what that means is that you hear the phrases like player trust and player value thrown around a lot. And so one of the ways that we developed such a strong, passionate community of developers was people at Riot don't have a community manager they have to go through to talk to players. They just go talk to the players. They get to play with Riot in their name. I have Riot in my name and Girl in my name, which makes things interesting sometimes. But often, not those times, it's actually really fulfilling. And players have a really complicated relationship with Riot because they feel like they have a voice, but they don't always feel like it's enough. And when the walkout happened, all of the organizers and some other folks got up and talked. And what I did was I got up and I read messages from our players. So I solicited some on Twitter, and then also there were just a bunch of comments. And by and large, the people within our communities and the typical networks that they use were just not only super supportive, but so savvy.
Oh, wow.
When the first thing happened, when the first article about it came out from Waypoint, there was a thing in it about how one of the leaders was like, we're going to host small focus groups. And the top Reddit comment on our League of Legends was like, oh, way to union bust, guys. Divide them into small groups. Yeah. Cool tactic. And it's yeah. And the conversation was like bizarrely nuanced, and I had all kinds of players reaching out to me and to people that I know, saying like, "Hey, how do we help?" I did say like, "Please don't boycott," because realistically, that's really not going to do much. But what you can do is like send in letters or like just tweet a bunch, like literally just tweet a bunch and force the people who run Riot corporate Twitter to read all of those replies on every single thing.
Signal boost.
Yeah, signal boost. It's not always the most satisfying answer because, like you said, it does have to kind of be the developers. But at Riot, I feel like one of the ways that we can energize people instead of just having them kind of wear themselves out, which, like you said, is like kind of the goal. Instead of having people just wear themselves out, you can energize them by saying like, hey, like, let's say that we don't ship a game because of this. Because that's an anxiety that developers have too, by the way, around this, is like, is this really what I should be caring about when I'm trying to ship the S in Riot Games, right? If you have a player base who you do all this work with, who you connect with as people and say, hey, like, we're people, we suffer. If you have a player base that says, hey, we would rather wait a year for that game if you can get this shit figured out. If you have a player base who doesn't like just get furious because something has been delayed for 6 months. If you have a player base who shows that they care about rioters instead of just Riot, that is the way that it can be powerful, because that sends a really clear message to the people making decisions that shipping things quickly at the expense of humans is no longer acceptable to the people we're shipping them to. And so in that way, I do think they're really powerful.
All right. Well, where can people find out more if they're at a studio somewhere out there watching? Like, what's it, and they want to know more? Is that gameworkersunite.org?
Yeah, I would recommend people going to gameworkersunite.org. You can also go to gameworkersunite.org/get-involved, where we have a full list of all of our, I think it's now 28 local and national chapters around the world. We're on 5 continents now. We have membership on 6 continents. And there are actually people meeting and organizing and getting organizer training and like actually pushing campaigns in their workplaces and communities right now all around the world. And so if you want to get involved in that kind of thing, people absolutely should. I personally run a lot of organizer trainings online, so even if there's not a community near you, there's always a way to learn more and start even taking the first baby steps. You know, you don't have to do it all alone. I think getting a community is radically important, and I think GameWorks Unite is a great community for that, because it's full of literally just hundreds of people all around the world trying to help make the industry a little bit better in whatever little way they can. So I think learning more and checking out a local community, if you have one, is the way to go on that.
All right. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Jocelyn.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much for coming by.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having us on.
Yeah. We're going to take a break and reload the couch with some other guests and do this all over again for another couple of times tonight. But now we're going to take a break, and then I'll be back. After that, I have to go to the bathroom.
Hell yeah.